To you Dr. Mark Edmundson, who is the university professor in the Department of English at the University of Virginia. We were just talking as folks started to enter for the program about the challenges and pleasures he has had teaching online, which is nice to hear that there has been bonuses to that. Mark Edmundson is a widely published and prize-winning scholar and author who has appeared in, his work has appeared in publications like Harper's, New York Times, and Atlantic. He has won rave reviews for books like The Fine Wisdom and Perfect Teachings of the Kings of Rock and Roll, which was named by Kirkus Reviews one of the best memoirs of 2010. Teacher, the One Who Made the Difference, a New York Times notable book of the year in 2002, a series, Why Write, Why Teach, Why Read, as well as The Heart of the Humanities, Reading, Writing, and Teaching, published by Bloomsbury. I think you hear a theme here about someone who takes what we take at the Athenaeum very seriously, what it means to be a scholar, a lifelong learner. Tonight, we are excited to hear from him as he speaks about his newest release, which you can check out at the Athenaeum, and we'll also give you some links to buy at the end of the program. Song of Ourselves, Walt Whitman and the Fight for Democracy. Dr. Edmundson, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. I invite everybody to join me in virtually welcoming Mark Edmundson to the Athenaeum. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here in Philadelphia. I guess it's Philadelphia, give or take. And thank you for coming, and thank you in advance for your interest in Walt Whitman, an absolutely magnificent poet. My my title for the talk is Walt Whitman Invents America. It's a bit of a hyperbolic title, right? Because no individual invented America. But what I mean to say by this is that Walt came upon a cultural situation where he looked back in time and he saw a couple of documents that he was very, very proud to be a part of in his own way. And those were the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He adored them. But he felt that there was something missing in America. And what was missing was a feeling of spiritual connection among its people. What he wanted wasn't just legalistic democracy, but what we might call spiritual or emotional democracy, the love of comrades, right? And he didn't think that we could succeed as a nation until we had augmented the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution with a kind of literature that would unite us person to person and bring us to completion, or the beginning of some kind of a completion as a democracy. So this was Walt Whitman's contribution. He believed in his heart that most all literature that had been written up until the point that he sat down to write Leaves of Grass in 1854, despite what its merits may have been, was antiquated. He referred to almost all of it as feudal. That is, it celebrated kings and queens and dukes and duchesses and exalted the rich and famous at the expense of the poor, the working class, and the everyday. Walt felt that this new form of government, relatively new form of government, required a new form of literature. And that form of literature he was going to inaugurate in 54 and 5 with the publication of Leaves of Grass. Now, these are enormous ambitions, right? Who was this person who had these amazing ambitions? I can answer it in one sentence. He was nobody. He was absolutely nobody. He had no particular distinction, no Harvard, no Yale, no Oxford, no Cambridge, nothing along those lines. He was a carpenter. He left school at 9 years old. He was a working man for the most part. He wrote a fair amount of journalism. He had written some poetry. It wasn't any good. He had written a novel. It wasn't any good either. And yet in his mid-30s, having ingested particularly the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, he set out to write the ultimate American poem. And it's my belief, and I hope you'll at least be able to entertain this belief as tenable by the end of our talk tonight, he believed he had done it, right? And with the 55 Leaves of Grass, and particularly with the long poem that anchors that volume, the poem that eventually came to be called Song of Myself, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Walt's background. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple of the high points of Leaves of Grass. I'm going to talk to you about the grass, which is his master metaphor for the poem. And I'm going to talk to you about the sun, which is one of the few images. Walt is a very hospitable and benevolent sort of poet. I'm going to talk to you about the sun because Walt has some hostility to the sun. Dazzling and tremendous, how quick the sunrise would kill me if I did not now and always send sunrise out of me. Right? That's Walt facing off with the sun. Why would so benevolent and all-loving a poet be so annoyed and threatened by the sun? Well, we shall see. Okay, there's a lot more in this poem that I'm going to be able to talk with you about tonight, and I hope that you'll read the poem and perhaps read my commentary on it. But these two particular points, the grass and the sun, seem to me crucial, excuse me, to an understanding of the work. The other thing that's crucial to an understanding of Song of Myself is that it doesn't end with the last word. In my opinion, that poem culminates in the hospitals of the Civil War, where Whitman went to do astonishingly unselfish work, beginning late in 1862 and staying there on through until the war was well over. He continued to nurse and visit men wounded, dying, even after the peace had been concluded. So I think what you'll be able to see is that Walt imagines a certain kind of democratic person. And when you see this imagining, you think, is it really possible that anybody could be like that? And then I think, give or take plus or minus, he walks off into the Civil War hospitals and he embodies the kind of democratic person that he prophesied in his work. Right? So a little bit of background on Walt. Before 1855, the year Walt Whitman published the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he had achieved no distinction whatever. He had no formal education, no Oxford, no Cambridge, no Harvard, no Yale. His life up to his 35th year had been anything but a success. He'd been a teacher, but he was loose and a bit indolent and refused to beat his students. He published fiction of a dramatically undistinguished sort and edited a Free Soil newspaper, opposing the spread of slavery into the territories. He'd written a good deal of journalism, but there was nothing remarkable about any of it. Much of the time, he was a working man. He was adept as a typesetter, difficult and demanding trade, and he worked as a carpenter. In the summer of 1854, the year before the great volume appeared, he was framing 2- and 3-room houses in Brooklyn. At lunchtime, he was sitting down with his notebooks, writing his thoughts, and reading the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, preeminently the poet, the oversoul, and self-reliance. Whitman's family life was chaotic. His father, who died shortly after Leaves came out, had a knack for failure. Many scholars believe that the poet depicts Walt Whitman Sr. in There Was a Child Went Forth. The father, strong, self-sufficient, manly, mean, angered, unjust. The blow, the quick, loud word, the tight bargain, the crafty lure. Walt's mother, Louisa Van Velsor Whitman, held the family together. She was a hard-working, capable woman who kept house well into her 70s. Walt adored her, thought of her constantly, and wrote her beautiful, affectionate letters. Walt's brothers and sisters formed a difficult brood. Jesse, the oldest, contracted syphilis from an Irish prostitute and died in an asylum. He was prone to rage and sometimes threatened family members with chair. Andrew Jackson was an alcoholic, married to Nancy, also an alcoholic and a prostitute. Andrew and Nancy had 3 sons, one of whom was run over and killed while playing unwatched in Brooklyn. Edward, Walt's youngest brother, was mentally disabled and prone to fits. Eddie had a huge appetite and needed to be watched at meals because he would eat until he passed out. He lived with his mother, Louisa, until she died. Then Walt took care of him. Walt's sister, Hannah Louisa, married an artist named Charles L. Hyde, introduced to her by Walt. Hannah and Charles moved to Vermont, where they made each other miserable. Hannah besieged the Whitman family with letters complaining about her unhappy state and provoking ongoing debate on what she ought to do. Mary Elizabeth, the oldest of Walt's sisters, lived a quiet life. His brothers, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington Whitman, you see this is a patriotic family, were solid and in time very accomplished men. Jeff became an engineer in St. Louis. George joined the army and rose through the ranks, retiring with high honors at the end of the Civil War. He was quite a soldier. As difficult as Walt's family was, he never turned away from them. He did all he could to help each and all. For their part, they loved Walt dearly, though none of them could understand a word of his poems. From this background, America's greatest poet emerged. It is still absolutely a miracle that this occurred. It's absolutely a miracle. How could somebody emerge from this background and write what is to me the ultimate volume of American poetry? No one really knows. Now, a word about the poetry. I see Whitman's Song of Myself as an American quest. It's a coherent and continuous poem that chronicles the expansion of the poet's mind and heart. It's a poem of education and of self-discovery. The objective is to travel through fields of spiritual challenge, to discover and affirm a better self and a better democracy. In the poem, Walt Whitman begins as an everyday character, one of the roughs, the figure he calls himself. He emerges at the end as a democratic person, as an emblem for America. The poem dramatizes the struggle to engender a democratic individual, but it's also a quest to engender true democracy. Whitman doesn't only quest for himself, he quests for his nation. If he wins, we win, but we need to know how to interpret the victory. Whitman moves into his journey from one moment of intense encounter to another. In symbolic form, he faces and by and large resolves major spiritual, political, and personal challenges. He will leave perfumes and books behind, step outside to become, as he likes to say, undisguised and naked, join self and soul in a stunning sex scene, and find the ultimate metaphor for democracy. He'll go to war with the sun, embrace sex in his own idiosyncratic way, teach us the uses of violence, become Jesus on the cross, resolve relations with God the Father, and reinterpret death. In the poem, he travels from one critical encounter to the next, taking on larger and larger challenges. His daring, imaginative encounter with Jesus, which is a climax of the poem, draws on all he has learned and achieved up until that point. In each resolved crisis encounter, Walt gains strength, and then, augmented, moves on to the next and the next. Ultimately, Whitman wants to show us how to live a righteous life that is not based on commandments and constraints. He seeks to demonstrate how our highest moral obligations can lead to happiness. Whitman found tragic joy during the Civil War. A few years after he published the first, and to me the best version of Song of Myself, Whitman moved to Washington, D.C. There he did work with the wounded, sick, and dying in military hospitals that was unselfish, imaginatively humane, and self-sacrificing. It can still inspire awe. In the hospitals, I want to suggest to you, he became a version of the large-hearted democratic individual that his poem prophesied. What Whitman offers now and always is hope. The hope that this new form of social life can succeed and thrive and give people access to levels of happiness and freedom that they've never enjoyed before. Whitman was not a grinning optimist. He was very badly depressed when the 1855 Leaves of Grass failed to reach the nation. He's horribly downcast as he saw the Civil War gathering. He knew the spiritual path he laid out in song was a difficult one. Nothing the poem prophesied came as a given. It all had to be earned. What Walt offered as symbolic action remained for us to enact fully in the world, or failed to do so. Yet Walt never withdrew his hope that America could be a great nation, not only for some, but for all of its people, and that we would be an example for others across the world. Of Leaves of Grass, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the preeminent literary figure of the day, wrote, "I find it," and Walt sent it to him absolutely unbidden, right? He didn't know Emerson. Emerson didn't know him. Emerson received book after book every day because he was the ultimate arbiter of literature in the year 1855 and thereafter. And Walt sent him the book, and instead of tossing it into the trash can, which he could well have done, or instead of reading it and exploding in vanity because the poem that Walt wrote was exactly the kind of poem that Emerson so badly wanted to write himself and couldn't quite manage to do, what he did was read it and write back very quickly to Walt. Best lines probably ever written by one great writer to another. "I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I am very happy in reading it, as great power makes us happy." It makes us happy, that is, if we can recognize it for what it is and what it asks of us and not turn away. It has the best merits, Emerson wrote, namely of fortifying and encouraging. So it did then, and so you'll see, maybe it does now. Everybody knows the beginning of Walt's great poem. "I celebrate myself," right? "And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you." Most beginning readers of Whitman think that the you of the second and third lines refers to the reader. And in this, there's surely some truth. But the you that Walt is talking to, "what I assume, you shall assume," seems to me not only and not even primarily the reader, but another part of Walt himself. Whitman is talking to his soul. He's trying to make the self attractive to readers, yes, but he's also attempting to present the self in a way that will coax forward the soul. The soul, at least Whitman's soul, is uneasy about entering the world as it is. Yet to Whitman, the soul belongs in the world. It is rightly one with the physical. Every atom that belongs to the self belongs to the soul as well, or at least maybe it could. It's not enough for Whitman to coax the soul forward. Self and soul must marry for Whitman to continue his quest to create a vision of spiritual democracy. There are a number of shocking moments in this poem, and two things are salient if you read the poem carefully and for a long time. One is how absolutely shocking and original it is, and number two is how relatively coherent it is. It can seem all over the place, but Walt is a very consistent kind of intellect, yoked to an amazing, extravagant imagination, right? There are a number of shocking moments in the poem. The first of them occurs after the self has beckoned the soul forward. "I believe in you, my soul," he says. In other words, stay steady, don't draw back, I can protect you. "I believe in you, my soul, the other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. Soul must dominate self. Self must not dominate soul. Walt demands perfect equality in the social world, but also in the interior world. There follows then what can only be described as a love scene between self and soul. Loaf with me on the grass, loose the stop from your throat. Not words, nor music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice. I mind how we lay in June, such a transparent summer morning. You settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me, and parted the shirt from my bosom bone and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart, and reached till you felt my beard and reached till you held my feet. This, as I understand it, is the self describing an erotic encounter with the once shy soul, in which the soul becomes quite aggressive. You plunge your tongue to my bare stripped heart. It's now the self that is vulnerable. Its heart has become naked and fully present. What's going on here? I don't think it's too much to say that Walt's soul was ravishing Walt's self. The soul has become actively desiring. It lies down with the self and settles its head athwart the self's hips and reaches its arms out from beard to feet, a long-armed soul. The head athwart the hips, fellatio. The eventual target of the soul's tongue is Walt's heart. That indicates that the soul has penetrated the self far enough so that the self is no longer wary of the tenderness that the soul embodies. The self's heart is more now than just a physical organ. It's a center of compassion, feeling. Readers have spoken of Whitman's extraordinary delicacy. Precisely so. Whitman achieves his delicacy by opening himself to the soul. The two parts of his being, self and soul, have become one, imaginatively at least. The self is not abasing itself to the soul isn't abased to the self. To Whitman, abasement is the worst possible act. It smacks of aristocracy and Whitman's major cultural foe, feudalism. Self and soul are married as equals in this strange ceremony. At last, self and soul are one. By merging self and soul, worldliness and sensitivity, Whitman reaps some benefits. His vision enlarges. He can see more, know more. Whitman's imagination now becomes mobile and expansive. Through the merger of self and soul, fresh perceptions arise. Swiftly arose and spread around me the peace and joy and knowledge that pass all the art and arguments of the earth. He knows that all men are his brothers and sisters and lovers. He feels at one with God, and he sees the wonder of the creation down to the mossy scabs of the worm fence, heaped stones and elder and mullein and pokeweed. Walt sees high and low and finds things both strange and wonderful. Whitman understands that everything that exists is a miracle. The brown ants and the little whales as much as God himself. Democratic vision perceives the sacredness of all that is. This knowledge becomes Walt on an intimate level when he dares to expose his tenderest and most imaginative part under the protection of his worldly side. When he gets the ratio of defense and sensitivity just right, sealing the conjunction with erotic intensity, he's rewarded with an enhanced sense of being and with visionary powers. And now here's the big payoff, where Walt arrives at the major trope, the signature of the poem, right? Whitman says, well, alive with fresh capacities, Whitman achieves a central image for democracy, the grass. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. Whitman says that he does not know what the grass is any more than the child does. He can't and he won't offer a literal answer to the question. Instead, he spins off into an amazing litany of guesses. The grass is the flag of Whitman's disposition out of hopeful green stuff woven. It's the handkerchief of the Lord. It is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. It's the beautiful uncut hair of graves. The grass reminds Whitman of the beards of old men and the faint red roofs of the mouths of the dead. He offers one metaphor for the grass after another, and one feels that now, in this new incarnation, he could go on forever. Walt's power of metaphor making has become fully activated by what he's achieved by merging self and soul. The grass is many things, but chiefly, the grass is the sign of equality, equality within democratic America. Here's Walt. I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same. I receive them the same. We are all, black and white and red, everyday people and distinguished statespersons, blades of grass. Nothing more and nothing less. We arise from nature, and to nature, the grass, we return. But here is Whitman's crucial paradox. By affirming ourselves as nothing but leaves of grass, we become more than individual leaves. We become part of the beautiful unity out of many one that is the field of green blades shining beneath the sky. Whitman has found a magnificent metaphor for democratic America and its people. We are like the grass. No two grass blades are alike. They're a little like snowflakes. Each one has its own being. Each has a certain kind of chlorophyll-based individuality. It's step back, and you'll see the blades are all more like each other than not. And what are these blades of grass but an emblem for Americans? We are different from each other, but we are also at least as much alike as we are different, and probably more so. This place, this America, is where we can be ourselves to the utmost and yet share deep kinship with our neighbors. And who are our neighbors? Canuck, Congressman, Tuckahoe, Cuff, Canadian legislator, Virginia planter, black man, all of the teeming blades of grass that we see around us. Together, the blades of grass create an expanse of green, a verdant quilt that covers the ground. When you stand back far enough, you can't see any of the individual blades. They form a whole, an organic unity. But look closer, and there they are, the grass blades, vibrant and unique, no two alike. We say e pluribus unum, for many, one. But who could have envisioned what that would look like and how it would feel before Whitman came along? Walt offers the grass passage to the readers as a thought experiment. Try imagining yourself as a blade of grass, one blade among a beautiful profusion. You're not identical to the blades around you, but you're not far from being so. At any moment, you might emphasize your singularity, what makes you unusual among the mass. Or you might emphasize your identity with the blades that surround you, your solidarity with all. Sometimes you may not feel that you're all that much of anything yourself, but the effect you help create is formidable. The green world of democracy. You have the comfort of unity, and you have the pride and focus that comes from individuality. We are all so many uttering tongues. The grass is the answer to the problem that bedeviled Emerson, how to resolve the tension between the individual and the group. Emerson is sometimes hopeful. When you speak your deep and true thoughts, no matter how controversial, in time the mass of men and women will come around to you. Each will say, this is my music, this is myself. But mostly, Emerson, great as he is skeptical about getting the one and the many to cohere. Society is almost inevitably the enemy of genius or even individuality. Whitman's trope of the grass suggests that the one and the many can merge. But I'm not sure that Emerson would find the distinction between one grass blade and another to be enough to account for the distinction between the individual genius and the ordinary, rather undistinguished soul. To Whitman, the poetic genius, the President of the United States, and the everyday working man really are close enough to be compared to one blade of grass and another. But this is something that Whitman will need to prove, both in his poem and beyond, in the world of experience. With the discovery of the democratic metaphor of the grass, Whitman has crossed another threshold in his quest. He now understands and feels how equal we all are, person to person, being to being. And that discovery allows him to make a loving, admiring connection with all the people around him. Whitman's discovery of the grass lets him imagine a world without significant hierarchy. Can any distinct blade of grass be all that much more important than any other? In it, we are equal, part of one great human and material body. When you embrace the metaphor of the grass, make the grass the national flag, as it were, you get to love and appreciate all the people who surround you. You become part of a community of equals. You can feel at home. Knowing what he knows, feeling what he feels, Whitman can now take us on a tour of the democracy and show us what we might achieve by following him. What he is dramatizing in those amazing, famous catalogs of people doing what they do every day is quite simple. These are brothers and sisters, he effectively says. Figuratively speaking, the marriage of self and soul gave Walt the imaginative power to create the metaphor of the grass. So the grass metaphor leads Walt on to more inventions, to his amazing catalogs. Affection and friendship can rule the day. There is no reason to sweat and strain and compete and seek the highest point. You're at peace here. You're at home. Relax, or loaf, one of Walt's favorite words, acts or anti-acts, and enjoy the experience of being. This is a party that everyone is invited to. In general, we walk the streets with a sense of isolation. We're individuals, monads, but if we can move away from our addiction to hierarchy and exclusive individuality and embrace Whitman's stroke of the grass, our experience of day-to-day life can be different. We can look at those we pass and say, not that is another. Instead, we can say, that too is me. That too I am. Or so Whitman hopes. Of course, an effort is involved. Whitman's benefits do not come for free or simply by reading a poem. We've got to meet his vision halfway by being amiably friendly, humane, and non-hierarchical. As we'll see, this repudiation of hierarchy is not so easy. It's not clear that even Whitman himself pulls it off. Isn't he trying to be a great poet here? The first truly American bard? The inscription to the final edition of Leaves begins, oneself I sing, a simple separate person, yet utter the word democracy, the word en masse. Is it possible to be a simple separate person and yet fully part of the mass? So there's the image, the most positive image of the poem, the image of the grass. Whitman is in love with it and he would like us to love it too. Whitman is extremely resistant to being negative about anything, right? He doesn't spend a lot of time fulminating in his poetry about feudalism and aristocracy. Generally, what he wants to do is turn away from it and dramatize a better way of life than the way of being mesmerized by the great, the powerful, and the rich. Yet at a certain point, and I think it's a signal point in the poem, Whitman turns in the direction of the sun, right? And he has something to say about that. And this fits in with, a couple of the elements of Whitman's vision that I think speak to us the most now. The metaphor of the grass is a metaphor of acceptance and affection for our fellow citizens in the democracy, right? It's about loving, understanding, sometimes tolerating, decently approaching all of the people who surround us. What it's disposed to try to overcome is hatred among citizens, the kind of hatred that sent America to civil war in 1861, and that may in fact be prolific at our current moment. The other great danger to democracy is fascination with greatness, power, money, riches, gold, the whole business. And Walt's going to get into that now from his unusual sort of angle. Whitman seems to love every aspect of the natural world without qualification, every aspect but one. He sometimes, not always, finds the sun to be distressing, even an inimical force. Few are the writers who launch vendettas against old King Saul. Ahab says that he'd strike the sun if it insulted him, but the enmity doesn't seem terribly specific. He might as well have said that he'd strike heaven. Whitman, though, is bothered by the sun. He casts an aspersion here and aspersion there. At one point, he announced that there are millions of suns left. Another time, he speaks of the suns I see and the suns I cannot see, multiplying the suns a bit and so diminishing it. But at about the middle of the poem, he becomes serious about his opposition to the sun. Here, the contention between Walt and the sun seems an issue of life or death. When Whitman describes the sunrise, he describes a struggle. Something I cannot see puts upward libidinous prongs. Seas of bright juice suffuse heaven. The earth by the sky stayed with, the daily close of their junction. The heave challenge from the east, that moment over my head, the mocking taunt, see then whether you shall be master. The sun is rising in the east, and rather than greeting it as a friend or brother, Whitman falls into competition with it. See then whether you shall be master. One assumes that is Whitman talking, not the sun. The poet fears being overpowered and dominated by the sun. How come? How could the brilliant, fructifying sun be an enemy of Walt's? Clearly, we're witnessing a power struggle. Mastery is at stake. Remember, Whitman hates abasement in all forms. Dazzling and tremendous, he says, how quick the sunrise would kill me if I could not now and always send sunrise out of me. Why does the sun bother Whitman as much as it does? Why does that sun seem to present itself as a figure of opposition in the quest to create American democracy and give birth to men and women of genuine egalitarian temper? Kings and pharaohs often find their emblem in the sun. affirming it as the sign of unified imperial power. It is one isolated and alone, and it is so magnificent that it can compel worship. I suspect that to Whitman, the sun is an image of royal power, and for the feudalism he hopes to displace. The sun is isolated and potent. It seems to rule the universe. It can stand as an emblem of absolute patriarchal rule. So the objective from Walt's point of view is to help us to become fascinated with the grass, that is, with our fellow citizens, seen on an equal plane and judged affectionately, and to move our attention away from the great, the powerful, the rich, the golden, and the glowing, right? And you do that not so much by demystifying or criticizing the sun. Derrida does that in his work. It's kind of an interesting correspondence. But it's a critique on his part. Walt does his critique quickly, and then he wants you to walk away and watch people living their daily lives and put your interest and affection there, okay, rather than in the direction of the sun, okay? So what happened when Walt published Leaves the Grass in 1855? Well, the most distinguished literary personage in America embraced it dramatically. And he tried to get his friends to love it as much as he did. But as persuasive as Emerson could be, there was a lot of equivocation about it. Thoreau didn't care for it. He found it kind of beastly. Emerson's other literary friends were neither here nor there on the subject, and the book did not sell well. Walt went from place to place, sometimes selling it by hand, selling it in phrenology bookstores, and it just never took off. It was reviewed pretty copiously, but 3 of the reviews were written by Walt himself. One of them began with the words, "An American bard at last!" exclamation point. It's a pretty good review and very perceptive, but it was, however, some people think this is unfair, I don't know why, by the author. Who knows a book better than the author? Why should the author not get to review it as frequently as possible, I say. So there's that, 1856, he published another volume, right? And he had engraved on the spine, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career, R.W. Emerson," which came from a letter. Emerson hadn't given him permission to do this, and Emerson, who's kind of an uptight Yankee, was very upset with Walt for a while. But you couldn't, once you were on board with Walt, you couldn't stay upset with him for all that long. And Emerson eventually came around. But he did an 1856 volume, an 1860 volume, and none of them ever reached the people that Walt wanted to reach. And that was just common everyday people, working men and women. His family, none of them could, as I said, none of them could read his poetry. And his brother George, who was a very accomplished soldier, probably one of the braver soldiers in the American Civil War, just said, "We sat down with Walt's poetry, and it made no sense to us. And then we sat down with the poetry of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and that made no sense to us." So, there was that. But they loved Walt, and they loved that he wrote poetry. He was so kind to them, and they were kind to him. And yet, it clearly is much more difficult than Walt would imagine. It's the reason I wrote this book, frankly. The reason I wrote this book is because although Walt can seem very available, it takes a little bit of work to get to him, and a little bit of guidance is not so bad a thing. My goal for this book, I'm very pleased to be here today. All of you are sophisticated enough to know something about Whitman, no doubt, and to have read him. I would like this book to be read by people in junior high school and high school and community colleges. The poem is published right there in my volume, and I want people to start with that and then come back forward and compare their interpretation of the poem against mine. I just want them to get a shot at Walt. One of the great things he's done is he has inspired so many poets. You name the poet, Walt has inspired them all through the America and the Americas, all over the world. He has inspired visual artists. He has inspired musicians. It is endless. People read Walt Whitman and they say, "Sure, I could do that." And that could mean write a poem, but it could also mean write a symphony. It could also mean paint a picture. Diego Rivera's astonishing mural in Detroit, the Detroit Industrial Mural, owes in many ways, as he says, to the influence of Walt Whitman. He said, "Well, if he can do that, I can do this." And if you've seen that mural, thanks to Walt, thanks to Diego Rivera, it's worth going to Detroit for. I love Detroit, but it's well worth it. So he's been bountiful in his power to inspire people. But let's see what he did next, right? He wasn't feeling great. The Civil War tore him apart. He did not want to see violence between Americans. And any intimation of that on the horizon would have broken his heart. Even now, it would. So in Washington, D.C., beginning in 1862, Walt completed his vision, attending on what he called the great army of the sick. It's now that Whitman becomes more than the poet of Song of Myself and begins to become a manifestation of the poetic vision. To complete the work of song, Whitman left the everyday world and entered into a hellish zone. Everywhere around him were men in torment, soldiers wounded, sick, and dying. They'd been brought by trainloads and boatloads from the battlefields of Virginia to the capital of the Union to be cared for, as well as resources in the state of medical knowledge allowed. Some would recover and rejoin their regiments. Some would go home, often without an arm or a leg, or as victims of double amputation. Many would die there in Washington. They died away from their friends in the regiment, away from their friends at home, separated by miles from their families, who often did not know where they were. Many of them died alone, and a number more would have if they had not been visited and attended to by a shambling, kindly old man, to the man Walt in his 40s seemed old, who was also the greatest poet that America ever produced. None of them knew he was a poet. He didn't tell anybody that he was. No, none of them had ever heard of him. He just kind of shambled from bed to bed, visiting with them and giving them small presents and holding their hands and writing letters all for them. Let's see what kind of time I have here. The men whom Whitman began to visit in Washington were not only wounded but sick, many of them wasting away from chronic illness. Diarrhea struck half of the Union troops and almost all the Confederates, eventually killing over 100,000 soldiers. They died protracted, humiliating deaths. Whitman was there to comfort as many of them as he could. In the final days of 1862, when Whitman came to Washington, there were about 35 hospitals in and around the capital, with about 13,000 soldiers being treated. The conditions were just astonishingly bad. Walt brought gifts. He came to the hospital almost daily with candy, chewing gum, tobacco, wine, brandy, shirts, and socks. He gave the men letter writing supplies, pens, and papers. If a man didn't know how to write, Whitman took dictation. If a man was too sick or injured to pick up a pencil, Whitman picked it up for him. Because of Whitman, many families were delivered from anguish, learning that boys were still alive. He did the soldiers' bidding as well as he could. A German boy dying asked for a Lutheran clergyman. Walt, who didn't like institutional religion terribly much, went out through the streets of Washington and found one. A young man named Henry Boardman was sick of hospital food. What would you like? Walt asked him. I would like some rice pudding, said Henry. Walt went out and got it for him. He was there every single day. In Washington, at the hospitals, Whitman effectively completed Song of Myself. He became a version of the individual the poem prophesied. He engaged his soul, clear and sweet, as he called it. His soul became his medium of connection with the sick and wounded and dying men. His spiritual imagination allowed him to see who they were, what they were feeling, and how we could help them. All of his imaginative mergers were rehearsals for the way he entered into the hearts of these young men. The tender figure that Walt brought forth at the start of song, compassionating, idle, and unitary, was in a sense there in Washington, looking on with side-curved head, sympathetic with all Walt. Walt's soul loved beyond measure in the hospitals. But in the hospitals, too, Walt was one of the roughs. He was tough. Whitman's endurance during the hospital years was astounding. He worked hour past hour, day after day in a horrible environment, doing all he could. His health was always in jeopardy, but somehow he held up for more than 2 years. In the hospitals, Whitman proved to be durable and strong. He truly possessed what Emerson said he did. It's a great phrase about it. Buffalo strength. That's what he told Carlyle. That man possesses buffalo strength. He showed that when a person allows himself full access to his vulnerable soul, he does not have to become weak and easily discouraged. In the hospitals, Walt was still that formidable man in the daguerreotype at the beginning of Leaves. Yet he was more than that, too. Whitman didn't bring God into the hospitals with him. Preachers of all stripes made their way to the wards, bent on shoring up the men's faith or converting them. Walt did no such thing. When Walt was in the hospitals, he kept moving, going from man to man, bed to bed, ward to ward, hospital to hospital. His poem showed him what it was like to stay in motion, giving all the love he could muster to this one and that, then moving on before he got caught up and encumbered. He included everyone in his hospital administrations, as Song promised he would. Union soldiers and Confederate, black and white, young and middle-aged. If you're in the hospital, Whitman was there to help you. Walt was friendly to everybody and took people on equal terms. Remember, he did not want to be extraordinary. He was one of the mass, one of the group. His job was poet. Yours might be blacksmith, tinker, or weaver, or soldier. You all did your best with pride. No one was better than anyone else. If you told Walt that he was extraordinarily wonderful, grand, he could well have been offended. He was one of the crowd, a citizen in the great experiment. One more passage here. I like to think of the author of Leaves of Grass as the man who let his poem teach him how to live. The voyage he went on taught him to walk away from ambition and striving. It brought him into the hospitals where he humbled himself in a way that few people can. We might say he became a servant to the democracy, clear and sweet and kind. Whitman's poem and his life in the hospitals set a standard for democratic thought and action, high standard. Surely few of us could even fulfill it. But I think he points us in the right direction toward a genuine form of democratic happiness. Who's Walt Whitman? He's the old man with the spewing beard, fanning the dying boy over there. He's the one writing that armless young man's letter home. He's there, over there, laughing with the nurses, teasing the doctor, trying to draw a little more attention to the boy in the corner, down with typhus. He just came onto the ward, laughing, with vats of ice cream in both hands. There he is. He's the one who wrote the best American poem, Song of Myself. And then, he's the one the great poem brought into being. He's up ahead and waiting for us. Thank you. So I think we do have time for questions. Not as much as I would have liked, but I think we do.
Thank you. Yes, and we have questions, and I invite all of you. I know I've been writing down. I've got my whole list of questions, so I hope you all have them, or you're going to get all my questions. But I do see them coming in. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. If the Q&A is a little challenging, for you to figure there, put them in the chat. So let's see. I think here, let's start from the top. Judith asks if you could say more about Whitman's encounter with Jesus as described in the poem. She's not heard of that. And thank you for your answer.
Yes. It comes about 2/3 of the way through the poem. And the first time I read it, I was shocked by it. And I'm still shocked by it sometimes. Walt has achieved the power to identify fully with people by midway through the poem. And at a certain point, he says, I discovered myself on the verge of the usual mistake. And he identifies with Jesus on the cross. Right? And so he goes through the bloody crowning and the death on the cross. And then with Jesus, he is buried in the tomb. And after a certain period of time, Walt and Jesus step out into the thoroughfare. And this is the important phrase, part of an average unending procession, right? So Jesus is understood not as the Son of God. He's de-divinized by Walt. He's understood rather as the first Democrat, right? He preached equality, he preached compassion, he preached brotherly and sisterly love. And rather than turning against organized religion, which Walt didn't like really, he turns in favor of Jesus and creates a democratic Jesus who is effectively, Walt Whitman before the letter. Jesus' teaching was fairly simple, as he said, love your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, and your whole mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Whitman wants to take it a step further, love your neighbor as yourself. And he wants to credit Jesus with that and see Jesus as the first Democrat. But when they're walking down the road, Jesus isn't up front and he doesn't have a halo on him. He's just part of an average, unending procession, one of the democratic individuals. And if you read the last part of the poem, it's all about religion. And Walt is very busy talking about all the past faiths that lead up to the faith in democracy. And most of them are deceptions from his point of view. They're mites brought by mother birds to spiritual starvelings who can't digest anymore. But Jesus is a towering, is a consequential figure to him. And the only one that he really wants to embrace in the whole religious tradition is Jesus, because he leads on in the direction of democracy.
Interesting. Here's a question from Marie. She's wondering if those last lines in your talk were yours. She said they're lovely and a great loving tribute, and that it's very like Whitman. She said, I wanted to write Whitman's sequel, but or Whitman-esque, but that seemed too futile.
Well, yes, thank you. They are mine. And one of the good things that happens when you're writing about an author is sometimes you get a kind of a flood of influence from the author, and in good ways you begin to sound both like yourself and like the poet. I will never, and I don't know if anybody ever will, equal Whitman's eloquence when he's at his best. But I'm very glad that you saw that kind of a conjunction, and I'm pleased to hear it. Thank you.
And Jeffrey notes that several of Whitman's poems have been set to music by composers, and wondering what qualities you see in his poems that particularly lend themselves to being set to music.
Well, I'm not a specialist in music at all, but they're clearly melodious and beautiful. And Walt does something that sometimes makes people, readers of his poetry, a little tired. He likes anaphora. He likes to start lines in exactly the same way, line after line. And I think some people enjoy putting that to music, particularly to folk music. But Walt also is, if you want to write a soaring, optimistic, bountiful music, and many people have done and still do, then Walt is a perfectly fine inspiration for that. I mean, you think about Emily Dickinson is another magnificent American poet. If you write music that's kind of comes out of Emily Dickinson, it's going to be a little bit more ironic and gnomic and complex and maybe undecipherable. But that's possible too.
Patrick asks, who among Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman do you believe has had the greatest impact on American literature and society, and why?
It's a wonderful question. It changes so much. Do you know what I mean? When I was in college, say, this was in the 1960s, 1970s, it was Thoreau all the way, right? I mean, Thoreau was anti-materialistic, anti-authoritarian, go to Walden, create your own world. All of that stuff was very central to that particular time and to the movements that surrounded it. When I got to graduate school in the 1980s, Emerson was ascendant. I studied with Harold Bloom. Bloom loved Emerson. Any number of people in the faculty were very engaged with Emerson. They didn't all love him the way that Bloom did. And Thoreau, because he was a talisman of the 60s, and the 60s were in sort of disrepute, was beginning to vaporize a little bit. Never vaporized for me. I continue to teach Thoreau. I love him. Whitman was more of an ongoing presence, it seems to me. He never crested, I think, the way Thoreau did in the 60s and the way Emerson may have in the 80s, at least in academia, but he's a constant presence, particularly among artists. Emerson is much beloved by scholars and writers of analytical prose, and that's fantastic. And Emerson is much beloved and much sometimes repudiated by people who concur with him or people who want to struggle with him. But Whitman finds artists where they live, and he makes them braver and bolder, and he just kind of pats them on the back and says, let's go. So I think Whitman is a constant figure, but in the culture at large, he may not have the kind of presence that Emerson and Thoreau have had. What I've tried to do with this book, and I'm a little bit ambivalent about it, is to show that there really is a conceptual dimension to Whitman that bears on democracy. I could have written a comparable book on the aesthetics of song myself, and I would have loved doing it. But it seemed that in our current situation, some kind of a contribution to the debate on the discussion of democracy was important. So I come forward with a rather conceptual Whitman, which I think will probably rub some of the Whitmanians, people I admire, the wrong way, because they would rather have Whitman the visionary, Whitman the artist, Whitman the inspirer, than Whitman the metaphorical thinker about democracy. Long-winded answer to
but that leads right into a question from Caroline, who wonders what you think Whitman would have to say about how democracy is functioning today in the United States.
It's a nice question. Thank you. I read these two sections about the grass and about the sun because I think they speak in certain ways to our moment. The grass metaphor radiates with a certain kind of a love of comrades, love of democratic fellow women and men that Whitman is very, very attached to. And I think that there's powerful temptation out there now in the direction of hostility, opposition, dramatic rejection to the point maybe of hatred. Opposition is very appealing. It gives meaning to life. And it gives focus, and you know who you are because you're not this person and you oppose that person. And so it's extremely tempting. And what Walt was trying to do was show people how to live with purpose in a non-oppositional manner. You know, it's not easy because opposition, I mean, William Blake, whom Whitman was mixed about, he encountered him late in life, said opposition is true friendship. Which maybe Whitman would think that was true to a certain extent, but basically what you want is opposition sometimes, but based upon ongoing affection and understanding, not hatred and repudiation. So all these books like, you know, Why Are We So Polarized? They are books that would distress Walt, and he would, I think, say, you know, think of the grass a little bit. The sun metaphor, of course, speaks to cult of personality, one man rule, what Freud called the longing for the father, the elevation of the patriarch. And in our, I'll dip into contemporary politics for just a moment, then run. I mean, in our last president, President Trump, one saw somebody who had many of the, or tried to generate many of the attributes of aristocracy. Everything was gold, everything was splendid, everybody was rich, everybody was famous. And we saw what an allure that can have. And I think Whitman understood that allure, and he took it very seriously. And he said, and yet you better watch out, you know. So the response to any sun infatuation, and that can be in politics, but also in show business, in sports, any kind of infatuation or hero worship is something that we'd want to not so much deconstruct, demystify, or undo the way Freud liked to do. And Freud was very insistent about undoing irrational forms, our association with irrational forms of authority. But we should turn away and look at something else, engage in something else, rather than obsessing about the rich and the powerful. And that something else is our friends and comrades in the democracy who are doing wonderful things all the time, even if we don't see it, you know?
Thank you. I think if we have time for very briefly to respond to one last question.
Sure.
And then we will wrap up. And this one was from Patrick. He said one of his favorite poems is "Oh Captain, My Captain," and wondering if you could just briefly discuss Whitman's admiration for President Lincoln.
Yes, it's a wonderful topic. But what I'm going to say next may be a little bit daunting. Captain, My Captain, which plays a starring role in the movie about the English teacher, which I repress all the time.
Dead Poet Society.
Dead Poet Society.
Dead Poet Society.
Which in the middle of my Whitman class we watch, and we go to war about that movie. I'll leave that aside. Okay. Captain, My Captain is one of the two famous poems that Walt wrote about Abraham Lincoln. The other being When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom. Right. And Captain, My Captain is a very unusual poem for Walt, very unusual. It's very traditional. It's in a ballad meter, right? And the other thing that is traditional about it is that it celebrates a charismatic, rather dominating leader, a captain, right? And Walt was extremely ambivalent about the poem. Every year he gave a talk about Lincoln that he loved doing it, give or take, he liked attention, but he used it to generate the money that he would live on in his old age with his talk. And as the talk moved to the end, the crowd would become raucous, wanting him to recite, "Oh Captain, My Captain," right? Whitman didn't care for "Oh Captain, My Captain" very much, but he would recite it because the people wanted it, right? So here was this amazing paradox for Walt. He wanted the people to love him. The one poem of his that the people absolutely loved was "Oh Captain, My Captain," and he didn't care for it for all the, predictable reasons. Lincoln is sort of pitched as a sun figure in that poem. The one he loved, and he should have loved, was "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom," where he comes up with a genius metaphor for Lincoln, and that is the powerful Western fallen star. Lincoln is a star, right? And the great thing about a star is that you can use it to set your bearings if you want to. You can use it to influence you in your life if you want to, but you can turn away from it too. He hit a home run with that one from the Walt point of view. But in terms of, people growing up and saying, my favorite poem, or not like last in the poem. I did have a student who felt that was her situation this term. But most people have heard of Oh Captain, My Captain, and it's a very complicated relationship to Whitman, and is a very rich relationship to Whitman and his work.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mark Edmundson, for this wonderful talk on Walt Whitman. His book is in our library, so you can check it out or get on the waiting list. And also you can buy it through bookshop.org. Tess, are we putting up a slide? She was thinking about, oh, Captain, My Captain.
There it is.
Bookshop.org/shop/Phila Athenaeum is our site for bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores, and also a portion of the profits will go to the Phila Athenaeum. So we encourage you to purchase the book to read more, and if your question was not answered, hopefully it will be answered in the book. I invite you also to come to our upcoming programs. Next week, we have Charles Duff, North Atlantic Cities. This is rescheduled from this time last year. We're so glad Charles will be virtually with us. Patricia Kennedy speaking on her new book, Justice Rising, Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White, on the 20th at 6 p.m. Our noon program on the 25th is with Dr. Jason Karlowicz about Alzheimer's, how science, culture, and politics turned a rare disease into a crisis and what we can do about it. His book is also getting rave reviews everywhere. Next Tuesday, if you have read Susan Albahawa's book, Against the Loveless World, her novel, which was one of our finalists for our literary award, my book group will be discussing that at noon. I invite you, if you have read that, to join us for more conversation. It talks about the challenges for Palestinians in their experiences in a novelistic form. Might have some bearing on today's world. Sign up for our weekly newsletter to keep up on programs that we have. Go to our website.